So if you're listening to or watching this lecture at home, let's try an experiment. But please, don't do this if you're in the car right now. Wait until you get home. If you're at home, go and turn on your computer. Open up your web browser and pick your favorite search engine. Google, Yahoo, it doesn't matter. And type into the search engine the word whois, W-H-O-I-S, with no spaces. And soon you'll see at least a half dozen links offering whois services. Services that will, in theory, help you identify the people behind various domain names on the internet. Seems like a wonderful service, almost like a Yellow Pages for internet domain names, right? If only it were that simple. It turns out that verifying a person's identity on the network is actually very hard to do. In today's lecture, we'll try and understand why that is so, and what we might do to fix the problem, if it's even a problem at all. Domain names are familiar to everyone who uses the internet. In any web address, the domain name is the portion of the address after http://www. So, for example, the website for my consulting firm may be found at http://www.redbranchconsulting.com. In this case, the domain name is redbranchconsulting.com. Domain names are familiar ways to identify the web page you're trying to reach, or the email address you're sending email to. We know them. We readily recognize them. Microsoft.com, that takes you to Bill Gates' company. And gov.uk, that takes you to the front page of Her Majesty's government in London. Of course, computers don't use names like Microsoft or Her Majesty's government to route traffic. They use numbers. The domain name system, or DNS, is, in effect, a translation system. It takes a domain name and translates it into an Internet protocol address, sometimes shortened, and we call it an IP address. The IP address is a numerical label. It's assigned to every device on the network, a computer, or a printer, or a server. The IP address is written in a format of 4 numbers, each separated by a dot. So, for example, one might be 172.16.254.1. The IP address tells the Internet routing system where a particular server is on the network. And then the Internet protocol tells the system how to get the message from here to there, wherever there may be. So the DNS IP combination is both an identification system, who you are, and an address system, where you are. By the way, and just as an amusing aside, tell you everything you need to know about the growth of cyberdomain that we're running out of IP addresses to assign. The way the system was originally designed, there were only 4.3 billion IP addresses to hand out. Only. And the last ones went out for assignment in early 2011. But don't worry, the engineers have a fix. It's going to take some time and effort to put it in place, but when they're done, we will have 340 billion IP addresses to use. That's a 34 followed by 37 zeros. So anyway, the DNS link works in a 3-stage process. First, an individual, me, Paul Rosenzweig, registers a domain name, say redbranchconsulting.com, which is hosted on a server somewhere. As it happens, Red Branch is hosted on a server owned and operated by a friend of mine. But you can buy your own server if you want to, or rent space on a server farm operated by another company. Second, that server is identified by an IP address. And third, when a potential client wants to access the Red Branch website by typing in that domain name, the DNS programming routes the request to the right server and returns the web page to the client. All of which means that the addressing function of the DNS is absolutely critical. If the domain name system were corrupted, hijacked, or broken, then communications across the entire internet would break down. And it also means that keeping a good registry of which domain names are in use is just as vital. If Microsoft.com is taken by Microsoft, the computer software giant, it can't be used by Microsoft, the hypothetical manufacturer of small, soft washcloths. Somebody needs to be in charge of keeping the books and making sure they're all straight. That somebody is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, also known as ICANN. ICANN is a nonprofit organization that sets the rules for creating and distributing domain names. As I explained in Lecture 3, the function for assigning names used to be done by a single man back when Internet first turned on. That man, John Postel, helped create the first Internet network as a project for the Advanced Research Projects Administration, or ARPA. But since ARPA was a federal government-funded agency, this in effect meant that the naming function was handled by the United States government. In the long run, of course, as the Internet grew to span the globe, a US-run and managed naming system was considered by many outside the United States to be insular and too unilateral. So ICANN was chartered in 1998 to transition control over the Internet from the US government to a nonprofit private sector organization. Today, ICANN operates from California, but it has a global constituency, registering new domain names every day. We'll talk a lot more about ICANN in a later lecture. For now, though, all you need to know is the job that it does. In theory, the domain name system should be completely transparent. Knowing a domain name, the cyber persona of a person or company, you should be able to find out who the real person behind the domain name is. Unfortunately, the system doesn't work as effectively as it should. If you're still at your computer, let's continue the experiment. And again, if you're in your car, don't do this until you get home, please. So first, let's go to one of those Whois sites we found earlier. In some cases, the registry works as we might wish. If you do a Whois search for the domain name heritage.org, you do find the actual organization behind the domain name. In this case, the Heritage Foundation, a think tank located in Washington, D.C. At least you can find the foundation's true address and the name of someone who works there. Try it and you'll see. But in most cases, the Whois function really doesn't help that much. To see that, let's type redbranchconsulting.com into the Whois search box. Now remember, redbranchconsulting.com is the domain name for the consulting company that I founded. When you execute the search, however, you don't get my name. Instead, what you get is a notice that the domain name is registered with a company called GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy, whose ads I'm sure you've seen, is a registry company that works with ICANN to organize the sale of domain names. Fortunately, they're a reputable company. So if you have a lawful reason to ask, if, say, you were the police conducting a criminal investigation and you had the correct legal authorization, then GoDaddy would tell you who was behind that domain. Me. The same is true of cyberwarbook.com, which is a domain purchased to promote a book I recently published. When you look up this domain name in a Whois service, you find only that this domain name is registered with Wild West Domains, another company like GoDaddy, this one owned by my cousin. Now, imagine that, unlike a consultant, you actually wanted to hide your identity. The obscurity of the domain name system makes it pretty easy. For example, one can, for a relatively small amount of money, create a shell company registered just about anywhere in the world. So let's say we created Not Great Courses Company in the Cayman Islands. If Not Great Courses then bought the domain name notgreat.com from GoDaddy, the true owners of the company could hide behind the corporate structure to conceal their identity behind the fictional cyber persona. Because domain name registry companies like GoDaddy or Wild West accept identification that appears to be lawful, And because they make no real attempt to verify the information they receive, the Whois registry is littered with errors, some accidental, others quite deliberate. As if the obscurity in the addressing registry weren't enough, there are plenty of other techniques for hiding on the internet. As we talked about in an earlier lecture, messages that transit the net don't automatically come with authentication. They may pretend to be from your friend, but that could be a spoof. That's a communication intended to fool you. For an example, an email from a friend, but with a slightly wrong email address. Or even worse, an email from your friend that is from his real address, but has been sent by someone who hacked into his account and hijacked it. Almost everyone who uses the internet has received at least one communication that's a fraud. "I'm stranded in London and need you to send me money" has become the modern-day equivalent of "I've got a great bridge to sell you in Brooklyn." This kind of blatant fraud and misrepresentation is commonplace. Even worse, many techniques exist to confound any effort to backtrack a message to an original source. It is relatively easy, as a technical matter, to gimmick an IP address so that a message appears to come from one location while actually coming from another. In a world where botnets allow a malicious actor to control computers other than his own, it is also quite possible to originate a message from a computer that is not your own, but is under your control. As a result, the commonplace is that virtually every intrusion or attack on the network is obscured behind a farrago of false emails, spoofed IPs, and botnets under the control of a third party. No attacker worth his salt would make any intrusion directly from his own IP address. They're always bounced through a number of false leads before arriving at the intended target. So this creates a lot of interesting double and even triple agent type possibilities. Remember how we talked about Stuxnet and how everyone is pretty sure that it was designed by the United States or Israel? But is that really the case? At least one observer thinks maybe not. Writing in Forbes, Jeffrey Carr, who's a well-known cyber writer, speculated that China might have been behind the Stuxnet worm. He linked the advent of Stuxnet to the failure of one of India's communication satellites. As a result of that failure, Indian service providers of direct-to-home telecommunications were forced to switch their traffic to a Chinese satellite, one owned by the Chinese government investors. According to Carr, the failed Indian satellite also runs on a Siemens SCADA interface of the exact same sort that Stuxnet targeted. This transfer of traffic was, of course, financially beneficial to China, who had a motive for inducing the change and for concealing its own role. Now, the speculation is probably wrong. The revelations about American involvement in Stuxnet are too detailed, I think, to be false. But Carr's guesswork does give you a sense of how uncertain identity is in cyberspace. Unfortunately, the problem of attribution and identification can't be wished away. The difficulty of identification is perhaps the single most profound challenge for cybersecurity today, for both technical and social reasons. It's not just that attribution is hard to do, though it is hard enough. It is that, as we explored a bit in Lecture 3, the converse of attribution, anonymity, is a fundamental part of our cyber consciousness. The anonymous internet stems from the architecture of the communications protocols, but it has been embedded as a quasi-libertarian streak that is at its core part of the DNA of internet society. For many of the people who first built the cyber domain, anonymity is part of their ideological commitment to a broad-based, diverse, individually empowered community. Let's leave the sociology of the internet aside for a moment and focus on exactly where we are today. Attribution is deeply problematic in cyberspace, and that makes the network vulnerable to attack. But problematic doesn't mean impossible. Think back to the story of the GhostNet intrusion we talked about in Lecture 4. The Information Warfare Monitor Group from Canada spent nearly a year on the effort and broke into some of the hackers' own computers to follow the trail. In the end, they were able to trace the origin of the intrusion to servers on Hainan Island, also the home of a Chinese military signals intelligence agency. What those efforts demonstrate is that when all is said and done, attribution is a question of resources and permission. If you are willing to devote enough time, money, and personnel to the issue, and if you have permission to do certain acts that in other contexts might be illegal, well, then good attribution can ultimately be achieved. The major problem with the effort, however, is that it takes a long time. How valuable is an attribution 6 months after the attack? Still, though attribution is slow and cautious, it can be done. In fact, one piece of recent good news on this front, at least from the perspective of the American military, is that in the right circumstances, we're getting better at identifying the malicious actors. As Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said in October 2012, quote, "Over the last 2 years, DoD has made significant investments in forensics to address this problem of attribution. And we're seeing the returns on that investment. Potential aggressors should be aware that the United States has the capacity to locate them and to hold them accountable for their actions that may try to harm America." For example, the National Security Agency has, through patient and diligent work, identified roughly 20 separate Chinese networks of hackers that are causing most of the espionage damage in America today. These near 24 groups are either tied to the Chinese military directly or tied to Chinese universities with ties to the government. According to public reports, the U.S. government even knows the names of specific individuals in some of these groups. In fact, in 2012, some researchers at Trend Micro, which is a cybersecurity firm, began looking at a Chinese intrusion program called Lucky Cat. As usual, the attackers used internet cutouts, intermediate command and control computers, and domains located around the world so as to make it difficult to track them. But with careful work, the investigators linked one of the command and control domains to an email address, and then to a QQ address. QQ is, by the way, China's equivalent of Twitter. Now, that QQ address, in turn, was tied to an online nickname, Schuhker, Scuhkr. Schuhker was almost certainly a reference to Sichuan University, whose internet domain name is scu.edu.cn. The CN is for China. After Trend Micro published its research, the New York Times went a step further. They conducted an additional investigation and discovered that the owner of the Schuhker alias, where HKR stands for hacker, was, according to online records, Gu Kaiyuan, a former graduate student at Sichuan University. So we actually know who the hacker behind Lucky Cat is. Which brings us to the final problem with direct attribution efforts, the "so what" question. For criminal intrusions, many of the malicious actors, though not all of them, live beyond the reach of American law. They often can't be extradited in countries. Likewise, though attribution does give us a better sense of when and how cyber espionage is occurring, that doesn't make a diplomatic response any easier. Thanks to the work of the National Security Agency, we have better proof that China is behind some of the cyber espionage that is happening in America. But if our other issues with China prevent us from taking effective countermeasures, what's the value of knowing? If the result of a massive effort to identify the source of an attack is nothing more than the increase in our storehouse of knowledge, then we might ask whether or not the game is worth the candle. So if that doesn't work, there has to be a different way, right? There is, though even this idea has its problems. The basic concept with this other idea is to accept that we can't do attribution by working backwards from the intrusion to the hacker. So instead, we're going to look at the problem from the other end. We will try to work forward by establishing an identity at the human-computer interface when a person actually puts her fingers on the keyboard. What this means in practice is trying to find a way to make access to the internet available through trusted identities. Sometimes this is caricatured as requiring a driver's license to use the internet. And though that's an overstatement, there is an element of truth to the caricature. The idea is to somehow control identity on the network when you sign on in a way that locks in an identity for later tracking. In the United States, this trusted identity system would have to be voluntary. It is almost impossible to imagine that any system requiring mandatory identification would be politically acceptable. In fact, a mandatory trusted identity system would probably be unconstitutional. Anonymous or pseudonymous speech has a long history in the United States. Just think of the debates that occurred at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Papers published essays by Brutus and Cato and the Federal Farmer. The most famous essays of all, the Federalist Papers, they were published under the pseudonym Publius. And in a case called McIntyre versus Ohio, the Supreme Court relied on that history and decided that the First Amendment to the Constitution protects the right to anonymous political speech. But a mandatory cyber identity program would make anonymous speech on the cyber network almost impossible. Still, even a voluntary system would be of some use. If you wanted to be careful, you could refuse to do business with anyone who didn't have a trusted identity. That would make it much harder for a thief to pretend that he was your bank's website. You could even create your own private networks with only trusted users. However, these types of programs they'll only take you so far. The system wouldn't be universal, and the network's very universality is its strength. One more point. The trend towards trusted identification on the network can go a good way towards solving the attribution problem, but at real cost to internet freedom. We need to consider whether broader American interests really are advanced by the widespread adoption of trusted identity rules. Trusted identity can enhance security, but one man's security purpose is another man's political oppression. Personally, I tend to think that America's long-term interests might be better served by fostering internet freedom of expression as a means of, say, fostering free speech and encouraging opposition to oppressive authoritarian regimes. That's because, for authoritarian countries, internet identification is a way of suppressing dissent. For example, China is developing an identification system that will eventually be mandatory, or so they say. Chinese officials have a new program that requires the users of the QQ microblog service, remember that's the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, to disclose their true identities to the government in order to post comments online. As Mark Rodenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center notes, internet identification is a principal means by which China controls its citizens. In addition to mandatory registration requirements, the government puts requirements on internet service providers and regulates access to internet cafes. Meanwhile, the designers of the network are fighting back. A few minutes ago, we talked about the sociology of the internet, its DNA for freedom, if you will. Some network engineers are working to keep the internet free. One example is Tor, a free software program operated by the Tor project. Tor is an anonymizing tool used by journalists, human rights activists, hackers, law enforcement officers, and anyone else who wants to. Tor uses cryptography to encrypt messages and builds a voluntary network of servers around the globe to bounce encrypted traffic in a way that evades detection. Tor is actually an acronym, TOR. It stands for the Onion Router. And it's called an onion router because trying to get to the original source is like trying to peel back the layers of an onion. It's almost impossible. If you use Tor software, you can conceal your originating IP address from discovery very effectively. Activists say that Tor protects personal freedom and privacy. Governments say it protects secrecy. In fact, Tor was originally designed by the Navy to protect its communications. Online activist groups like WikiLeaks say it promotes transparency. And criminals, well, they don't say much, but they're glad to use Tor to conceal their actions too. Of course, other network engineers are working in the opposite direction, trying to answer the original problem we started the lecture with: how to make identity on the network more easily verifiable. One major effort is something known as DNSSEC, which stands for Domain Name System Security Extension. Under DNSSEC, a new authentication security feature would allow a user to be sure that when they attempted to connect to a domain name, say whitehouse.gov, they are reaching the true whitehouse.gov website and not some phony facsimile of that website. In simplified form, each website or email address or other advice would come with an authentication certificate that reported, "I really am who I say I am," to anyone who asks. One benefit of this type of authentication system is that it would eliminate man-in-the-middle attacks. Those are attacks where the malicious actor steps into the middle of a conversation and hijacks it by making independent connections with the victims. From the middle vantage point, he can relay messages between the victims, making them believe that they are talking directly to each other over a private connection, when in fact the entire conversation is under his control. For example, without DNSSEC, your request to connect, say, to your bank, Chase.com, could be redirected to a phony Chase.com website. There, the malicious actor would record your traffic so that your bank password login information is collected before he passed it on to the real bank website. Since you actually eventually make connection to your real bank, you never know that something wrong has happened. And the thief can return to Chase.com at his leisure after you log off and steal you blind. This kind of attack is all too common today and has become one of the key tactics of many criminal gangs. Once DNSSEC is deployed, however, a security resolver function would be built into your web browser so that it will check the authentication certificate of sites like Chase.com and confirm that the website was authentic, eliminating the man-in-the-middle problem. I know DNSSEC sounds like an easy answer, but it's really very hard to accomplish for a number of reasons. First, DNSSEC has to be backward compatible. In other words, it has to work even with portions of the internet that have not yet deployed the new security protocols. Otherwise, changing over to DNSSEC would disconnect you from the broader web, and nobody wants that. Second, there is a very substantial cost for upgrading and deploying DNSSEC across the global range of servers and systems. The process will take years to complete. Finally, the biggest difficulty is establishing a chain of trust for domain name authentication. How do you know that the Chase.com webpage is authentic? Some certificating authority, say a company like VeriSign that is in the business of authentication, has sold Chase an authentication key. And how did Chase know that VeriSign itself was authentic? Well, VeriSign got their authentication certificate from someone higher up the ladder. At some point up the chain, there has to be an original root authentication that serves as a trust anchor to the chain of trust. Currently, the trust anchor is provided by ICANN, and some people outside of the United States don't trust ICANN because it is an American company that they think is subservient to American interests. And then there are the bad guys. If you have a chain of trust to establish identity for domain names, or for that matter, individuals, your chain is only as strong as your weakest link. And if your entire defense is based on establishing a chain of trust, we can be sure that bad actors will seek to undermine that trust chain if possible. That's actually what happened in July 2011 with an attack on a certificating authority in Holland known as DigiNotar. DigiNotar wasn't issuing DNSSEC certificates, but rather a different form of certificate known as an SSL certificate. The abbreviation stands for Secure Socket Layer. That serves more or less the same function as DNS. It verifies that a user has reached a legitimate website. SSL certificates work through the mechanisms of your web browser, which are programmed to automatically consult a list of authenticated websites that includes all of the authentications provided by DigiNotar. A hacker goes by the name Komodo hacker and claims to be an Iranian student penetrated DigiNotar. He used the penetration to issue more than 250 and possibly as many as 500 false certificates for real companies like Google. What that means is that if you typed in the web address mail.google.com and were redirected to a captive malicious site, that site would appear authentic because the browser would look for and find a valid DigiNotar certificate. Because countries like Iran are interested in tracking dissent, some suspected that Komodo hacker was an Iranian cyber spy. That suspicion became more pronounced when Komodo hacker also generated false digital certificates for the CIA, MI6, which is the United Kingdom Secret Service, and the Mossad, Israel's Secret Service. In the end, the only way to beat this attack was for the web browser manufacturers, Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, and Internet Explorer, to all issue Internet death certificates for DigiNotar and revoke all of the certificates the company had ever issued. That's small comfort for those who were spoofed by this particular attack, and it also demonstrates the fundamental flaw in any plan that relies for authentication on a chain of trust. Trust, it seems, can sometimes be forged. All things considered, the promise of robust attribution and identification is a bit of a chimera. Attribution is clearly possible in many cases, but it is also clear that creating a world of trusted and secure identities on the network is a nearly impossible dream. We can make a great deal of progress in some aspects of the effort, but in the long run, we have to understand that anonymity is a feature of our current internet architecture, not a bug. In short, there is no realistic way of creating a universal system of trusted identities, and we aren't even sure if doing that would be a good thing. As with almost everything in cyberspace, we can reduce the risks we run, but the fundamental problem of identity is here to stay. In our next lecture, we'll begin looking at some of the bad actors on the network, starting with the criminals. I'll talk to you soon.